Several guests on the podcast have talked about how militant professors, students, and administrators try to limit speech on campus, typically when that speech conflicts with left-wing political ideology. But the left, of course, does not have a monopoly on dogmatism or on censorship. Due to the intellectual demographics of academia, right-wing threats to campus speech come mostly from outside the universities. My guest in this episode, Sachs, explains how that works. Hi everyone, I'm thrilled to be talking to Sachs on the podcast today. Jeffrey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Very happy to have you on. So you are a lecturer at Acadia University. You obtained your PhD in 2015 from McGill University, and the title of your dissertation was Law and the Structure of Authoritarian Rule, Knowledge, Sovereignty, and Judicial Power in Sudan from 1898 to 1985. So yes, as this title indicates, you specialized in Middle East and North African politics in your research.
That's right. Quite a distance from I think the topic we're talking about today, but it is my day job is Middle Eastern and Northeast African law and religious politics.
Okay. And what led me to contact you is that you're also known for having contributed to public discourse around the issue of free speech and violations of free speech on campus. Mm-hmm. As I was telling you before we started the recording, we've had several guests on the podcast who talked about this topic, at least in passing or even in a more focused way. I mean, we had Zach Greenberg, who is a lawyer at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, the FIRE, which is an organism that, tries to monitor free speech violations on campus and to assist people who are being censored or whose rights are being violated.
It's an excellent organization, and Zach is a great attorney for them.
Nice. We were happy to talk to him. It's been a while, but still, it's indeed the FIRE does very good work, and so there's many ways one can start the discussion about free speech on campus, but maybe there is this sort of first level approximation of the paradigm for free speech violations, and you can tell me if you agree. But in my perception, you have threats from the political left, so to say, that tend to come mostly from within academia, maybe from militant professors, militant students. You have also something that maybe has grown in recent years, zealous administrators, who play maybe a somewhat forgotten role sometimes. And there's also threats coming from the political right, of course, and these in my perception, tend to come mostly from without academia, from activists, social media personalities, and especially politicians, maybe most dangerously. Do you think there is, truth in this rough paradigm?
Yeah, I think there's a great deal of truth. I think it's almost a cliche now how consistently threats from the political left seem to come from within campus and threats from the political right seem to come from off campus. And you're right, administrators play a different role. Administrators, to the extent that they play a threat, they're more concerned with public reputation, with relationships with donors or industry or governmental actors. And there's certainly a political slant, but it's hard to fit within a traditional left-right axis or spectrum. So it is the case when you look at where these threats from the political right are coming, it seems to be consistently off campus, or at least predominantly off campus. And they seem to dominate that kind of activism in a way that left-leaning actors do not.
Mm-hmm. This is also something that you wrote, I think, in one of your articles. This paradigm, I think one can sort of expect it if you just if one just bears in mind that the left is simply numerically dominant in academia. And so, without trying to see if there are heavier tendencies to be censorious, whether on the left or on the right, you can sort of expect already, just based on this fact, that the paradigm that we just presented will be present, and you will have the left, which is simply more. I mean, when you have more people in academia, right. So I mean, statistically, if you expect no difference in tendency to censorship between left and right, it's normal that there will be more censorship within academia from the left, and you will have the right sort of, being sort of defiant, more likely to see academia negatively, and trying to push back, so to say, from the outside.
That's absolutely correct. If you just look at the numbers, it seems to paint a picture of lopsided censoriousness, where the left is more frequently censoring than the right. But you're absolutely correct. That is, to a large extent, if not a majority extent, simply a function of the fact that whether it comes to the student body or the faculty or the kind of the forward student-facing body of administrators, they're overwhelmingly liberal or on the left, and so we should expect them to kind of dominate that kind of activism. The way that I think about it, or the comparison I make that I think is very helpful, is that the vast majority of faculty who have been punished or fired from their jobs for their speech are on the left. Now, that might look like a story in which the right is coming down disproportionately hard on the left. Another way of thinking about it is simply that faculty are overwhelmingly on the left. We should expect them to constitute a majority of the faculty terminated for their speech. So once we kind of get a sense of these broad population disparities, it helps us to put in context many of the headlines that we see that seem to paint one side as much worse than the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as I told you before we started recording, and actually even when I introduced you to the audience, we've had quite a few guests already to talk about various controversial topics that might draw the attention of left of center activists, and for researchers, professors who deal with this. It can be complicated, but yeah, today maybe it would be more interesting to talk about or to focus more on threats coming from the political right. And I don't know, what would be the topics that, if there is a professor, what can he or she say, in what venue? Is it going to be in the classroom? Is it going to be on Twitter? That might draw the attention of the sort of a right-wing outrage mob, to use not a very nice term, but yeah.
Right. I think it's a range of topics. So faculty who seem to be targeted by these sorts of right-wing activists tend to say speech that is very critical of the Trump administration or of conservatism or the American Republican Party writ large. They might be critical of the U.S., of U.S. foreign policy or domestic policy, and therefore seen as insufficiently patriotic. And they might be critical of Israel or of contemporary Israeli government policy, or perhaps insufficiently deferential to Israeli policy in regards to the Palestinians. So when you look at the kinds of issues that seem to trigger this right-wing activism, I think those are probably the big ones. The other one that I think happens, but it's difficult to categorize, is in Christian parochial universities or colleges. people who might say something that contradicts or is perceived to contradict the religious creed or orthodoxy of the institution, generally on social issues like LGBTQ issues or issues relating to sexuality or gender. That's another kind of area where we see this sort of activism, but it's more difficult to make sense of because many of the faculty who are targeted might identify as being very much on the right themselves. They're just being outflanked by someone who might have a more conservative standpoint.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I mean, this is kind of I mean, when you have religious universities, it's kind of, from the start, do you not sort of limit the discourse from the start if you have a religious university? I don't know. I haven't, looked into these type of universities this much, but I don't know if you have something more to say about these.
It's seemingly a unique American phenomenon to have these sorts of institutions. And it's very difficult because I think the image that many of us have about these institutions is not accurate. Major American research institutions like Georgetown, University of Notre Dame, these are research and pedagogical powerhouses that employ some of the top experts in their field and graduate students who go on to do very important work. And yet they are also Catholic universities. They are universities that adhere to creeds that very explicitly put limits on what students are permitted to say or faculty are permitted to say. And how you balance that kind of aspiration to educational excellence with codes that limit what people can say, that is very, very tricky. Which is why I think they fail very often. But, it's a tricky balance.
Yeah. I mean, it's something you didn't mention. It's also something that, in my perception, can get people in hot water. It's statements which will be perceived as racist against white people. I mean, sometimes they are indeed racist against white people, sometimes not. But statements that can be construed as such might, get you in trouble with the sort of right wing.
Yeah, Vincent, you're absolutely correct. That is a major category as well. I think maybe especially in the last 3 years or so, or 4 years, we've seen more incidents where a faculty member might say something like, whiteness is a disease. That's a kind of in reference to, I don't know what, but maybe a certain belief by the person that white supremacy in the United States is endemic and is a function of being white. I don't know, but that kind of language is often identified by activists as racist, and then they'll target people and try to get them fired or disciplined. And, to get back to something you said earlier, where does this kind of speech have to happen for it to attract the notice of these activists? I don't know if there's any kind of specific location. I think certainly social media is a really easy place to identify. Right. And so with the increasing faculty presence on Twitter, just like every other kind of political actor, we certainly see more and more Twitter as a source of this sort of speech. But also it's in the classroom, or it's in papers that are written or articles that are written. So there's no one place. I think there are so many conservative institutions and actors out there who make it their job day to day to surveil faculty speech and identify speech that will be controversial and then to publicize it, that you could say something anywhere, and it seems like there's a very good chance it will get back to these sorts of actors.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's. Of course, it's not surprising, but it's a bit ironic that sometimes these these groups that you just mentioned, if there is, apparent violation of free speech due to the left-wing activists, they will be up in arms. But if some leftist professor says something that they find outrageous, they will also try to censor them. This is on both sides. You will find this sort of hypocrisy.
Yeah, there are lots of actors who I feel are very sincere. Like, I think that FIRE is a good organization overall. But other ones, like in the United States, we have there's a group called Campus Reform, which is a conservative organization that is basically acting in concert with the Leadership Institute, another conservative organization, and the Republican Party increasingly. I think they're very toxic. They're a very popular organization. They're very influential in these debates, but they will come after you if you are on the left with every ounce of their energy to get you fired or disciplined or in some way for controversial left-wing speech. But then the moment any actor does something similar to a conservative, suddenly they're ringing the bell of free speech and the First Amendment and academic freedom. And so you really can't overemphasize the cynicism of a group like Campus Reform. Other organizations like Turning Point USA are the exact same way. These organizations are not to be trusted because they're just, I think, so fundamentally dishonest.
Yeah. It's unfortunate, but this is also what I've come to conclude about Campus Reform in particular. I mean, I had some initial interest when they were, reporting some cases of, say, censorship coming from the left, but then I realized that they are not being consistent at all.
Yeah, it's a shame. I think that there's a whole cottage industry now of groups like this on the right that you can get a lot of attention and a lot of clicks by being that kind of group, and people love it. But in the end, it's so apparent what their agenda is. And you know what's crazy now? I don't know if you're paying attention to them, but Campus Reform has flipped in a totally different position since the COVID pandemic broke out and all these universities got shuttered. And you're seeing now a very different tactic over the last month or so. What they're saying now is they're no longer really talking about academic freedom or free speech. Now it's overwhelmingly about what a rotten deal universities are, that this crisis, which has shuttered all these institutions, is a blessing insofar as it's exposing the hollowness of these institutions and how students should not pay for online tuition. They should not pay tuition for online learning, and that this should be an opportunity to institute these massive top-down reforms within these schools. So my read is that they see this as an opportunity to push a very different kind of avenue of attack on higher ed.
Okay. That's I was not aware of this, but noted. Can you give some either recent or very striking examples of crackdown on academic freedom coming specifically from politicians and from the right, as we are focusing in this conversation?
Sure. There were two terminations of faculty just this year on the left, of faculty on the left. Or sorry, one was this year and one was the very beginning of very end of last year. In one case, there was an adjunct professor named, I believe, Jeffrey Klinsman at Kirkwood Community College in Iowa. And last fall, he was targeted by state legislators, Republican state legislators, and by Republican media, conservative media, because of comments that he'd made on social media. In one case, I think 4 years ago, in another case, maybe a year or two ago, where he had said, frankly, inflammatory things about law enforcement, about police, and in one case about evangelical Christians. And but they were totally protected speech. It was completely legal speech. It was obnoxious, it was offensive, but it was completely legal speech under the U.S. statute and the Constitution. And Kirkwood College, or community college, being a public institution, means he has those protections. So he was targeted for that speech, and they successfully drove the college to fire him. In fact, things got so bad that the police had to provide security in his neighborhood, and he and his wife had to flee their property because the arson and death threats that he was receiving were so severe. This is just last fall. Again, over the winter, another adjunct professor at Babson College in Massachusetts, he also was fired outright by his university in that case because he made a very tame joke about the status, the low status of American cultural institutions. And for that, I suppose, that unpatriotic affront, he was targeted by conservative media and was fired within days and has not yet been reinstated. I doubt he will be. So cases like this are very, very, unfortunately, the people getting fired is rare. People getting targeted is very common. So those are just two in the last 6 months or so. There are many other cases of people being demoted or denied promotion or punished in some other informal way for their speech that ran afoul of these right-wing censors. So these things happen with, I think, unfortunate regularity. And you got to kind of stiffen the spines of these administrators and convince them that they really can just ride this out if they just stand behind their faculty, whether they're on the right or the left, and ignore this outrage. It tends to die down pretty quickly. In these cases, they did not do that. And at least in the case of Jeff Klinsman, they ended up having to pay out a settlement.
So you mean they had to pay this professor because they fired him?
They did, yes. It was a court settlement. Fire represented him, and about 2 weeks ago, the settlement was announced. It wasn't as much as I would have hoped. It was only about $25,000 or $30,000 US dollars, which is not very much, and probably speaks to how low his salary was at the institution. But I think you need to, if you really want to disincentivize this kind of activism or this kind of action by universities and colleges, you have to inflict a much higher punitive award for that kind of. So those are two cases, but honestly, there are so many. There are many that were not successful, but you've had all the way up to United States senators and United States representatives trying to pass laws or get executive orders issued that would severely restrict the ability of faculty to speak their minds. In Arizona, there is a representative named Paul Gosar, who's Republican, and he has requested, this is a U.S. representative, he's requested 2 different investigations by the Federal Department of Education of faculty at different universities because he believes that they are supportive of the boycott, divestments, sanctions movement, which he accuses to be, his claims of a terrorist organization. And on this basis, these faculty should be punished or potentially fired. In Massachusetts last year, the Massachusetts Republican Party filed a lawsuit trying to get a judge to block the University of Massachusetts from holding a conference on Gaza, the territory of Gaza. These sorts of incidents, they happen constantly because on the right, this is a way to get votes. This is a way to get attention. No Republican politician ever lost votes for going after higher education. It's a very popular stance.
Yeah, it's linked, I'm sure, to what you were pointing in one of your articles, which is that the reputation of higher education has gone down in among voters of the Republican Party.
It's gone down among Democrats as well, although for other reasons. It's gone down among Democrats because of issues related to mainly tuition, which are seen as very high. But among Republicans, it's a tuition issue, and it's also this belief that they are biased and they're brainwashing students, and that's very difficult to combat when you've got so many groups in place designed to kind of publicize inflammatory faculty speech.
Yeah. So, I mean, this might be a good transition because you mentioned this belief that some people have that students are being brainwashed on campus, and as you explain, it's kind of a tempting hypothesis because you have on campus a majority of left-wing students, or I don't know. I don't like to say liberal, even though it's the accepted term in North America. Say left of center students on campus, and an even clearer majority of left of center faculty, and it's tempting to conclude that there is some well, brainwashing is a strong word, but this type of phenomenon going on, and you've written about this.
I don't begrudge anybody for thinking this. This thesis, we can call it the indoctrination thesis. This idea that faculty are unfairly or unjustly affecting how people think. I mean, faculty, their job, to some extent, is to impart information and to get people to think a certain way about the world. That could be, something as straightforward as physical laws of the universe, or something as controversial as the nature of the criminal justice system, right? I mean, their job is to some extent tell people how to think. And you layer on top of that the fact that many of them are, like you say, left of center and very vocally left of center. Anybody will be forgiven for assuming that there is some significant degree of indoctrination, especially when in the United States, increasingly, people who graduate from universities tend to vote Democratic, tend to be on the political left. So really, a very straightforward argument. It seems to make sense every step of the way. Unfortunately, there's very little empirical evidence to support it, and there's a great deal to disprove it. I mean, the argument against it is that we have, if you compare somebody who went through university and their political behavior to somebody who is of a similar socioeconomic status but did not go through university, you'll find very little difference in their voting behavior. Students tend to go into university with a certain political belief, and they tend to leave university with the exact same political belief. Their thinking can change. There's no question of that. But if you go into university a conservative, chances are extremely good you will leave a conservative, because many of our political voting patterns and our political ideologies are set growing up with our parents. It's a function of our race to some extent, in the United States at least. It's a function of our income, of our gender. Educational status matters, but it doesn't seem to matter very much what your professors tell you, the classes that you take. All the careful kind of parsing that we see seems to overwhelmingly indicate that this kind of indoctrination, if it's even being attempted, is not having the effect people think it does.
So I've been wondering about this. I mean, I've read your writings on the topics on the topic a few times, and the data which you mention. I mean, you have several sources, and they look at different trends and different comparisons. But broadly speaking, or maybe specifically, you can tell me, do you think that if you sort of, look at different fields of study, different disciplines, you might get maybe a better resolution, and maybe you might start seeing that in some fields there is more, at least attempts at indoctrination that maybe one could not see for one reason or the other when looking at, college in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think here we'll have to be careful with how we use the term indoctrination because, one person's indoctrination is another person's education. And it all depends, I think, the permissible limits of faculty pedagogy are. I think the best thing I can tell you is that, or the clearest thing I can tell you is that if the people who take, let's say, a class in a discipline like English or women and gender studies or critical race studies, if you take a course in that, chances are already extremely good that you're on the political left. So we don't see much evidence that it nudges people onto the left. There is very scant evidence, but there is some evidence that it can shape the way that you are on the left. For instance, people who attend, there's a couple studies that indicate that students who take courses in women and gender studies tend, after taking the courses, to believe that sexism is a greater problem in society than they did when they went into the course. Okay, so we can say that if you identify that as shifting farther to the left, then we can say that some kind of change is taking place. I don't know how you or your listeners want to kind of parse that little fact, but we can say that kind of thing takes place. However, I think that the broader kind of claim that you sometimes see, that these classes or these disciplines are taking impressionable young students who are maybe moderate or on the fence and turning them into left-wing activists, there's no evidence of that. And that's simply because the students who take these courses tend to already be on the left than they are on the right. So we just don't see that kind of shift taking place. And then students who take, your average social science course, your politics course, your history course, your economics course, it doesn't really tend to affect them very much. Social science courses are more likely to make students politically active. A student who goes through a political science major is more likely to vote when they leave. They're more likely to donate to a candidate or a party when they graduate, but they're not more or less likely to vote Republican or Democrat. So we don't see that kind of shift. And I think one last point I'll just make, there's a corollary assumption that you sometimes see many on the left say, and that is that business colleges or economics programs turn students to the right. Well, there's no real evidence of that either. There's no real evidence that students who go through those programs are more likely to vote Republican or more likely to support conservative beliefs. So all of this, when you add it up, seems to suggest that a student's course of study has very minimal impact, if any, on their political behavior after they graduate.
Mm-hmm. So it tends, it looks like students with various personality traits just cluster in the majors that will interest them, and maybe surely I would say interest in some topics is correlated with some anthropological intuitions that might lead to political leanings. It seems quite likely that there is it's very organic that people just go where they like, and they just happen to find other people who have broadly similar tendencies, and maybe then this creates a little bit of groupthink. People stop questioning some beliefs that they have because everyone around them has it.
I mean, there's definitely a very vigorous debate among education scholars about why students select the majors that they do. A lot of the research seems to suggest that expected future earnings is a big factor. So if you think that the job prospects in one field are better than the other, you're going to do that. And then students tend to select majors they think they're good at. So if they in high school were really great at English, then they're going to more likely to go into that kind of degree. And then there's this other. I think what gets kind of the closest to what might be going on is there's this kind of very vague term of fitness, and sometimes students will gravitate towards fields they feel like they fit with. So it's very, very hard to measure what this is. We know it matters because students tell us that I feel like I just fit better in this field. I like the students in the class. I like the professor. So if there is a mechanism that preferentially selects conservative or liberal students for certain fields, this is where you might expect to see it. And fitness can make a big difference, but it definitely can be understood in different ways. It could be that you just met a really nice professor or a really attractive student in the course, and you want to take the course, right? I mean, like that happens all the time. And so, there are lots of different pressures that steer students in one direction. And I think it's possible that politics comes into it, but if it does, it is just one part of many different factors. And a lot of it seems to be something as straightforward as I was really good at physics when I was in high school, and I want to get good grades, so I'm just going to stick with that. So those tend to be the big causes.
Yeah. But one could argue, and probably I would argue, that both in terms of results and in terms of this vague feeling of fitting in with a crowd and a topic, these can be shown probably to strongly correlate with personality. So you will have these personality clusters forming fairly spontaneously, I would guess. But yeah, maybe more research is needed to assess this.
Yeah, I mean that's not an issue I guess I know as much about, so I'm really hesitant to speak to. I mean, I know that psychologists have developed this menu of personalities and certain kinds of dispositions that they have argued correlate with certain kinds of behavior. And so it may be that there's something to that, in which case it can help us explain, a conservative disposition aligns with STEM research, for instance. I don't know. That's possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, I mean the threats to campus free speech that we've been discussing, as we said, they can come from the left, they can come from the right, they can come from within or without academia. And if you look at the headlines, it can be quite striking sometimes, and you gave a few striking examples. But it's always important, to look past the headlines, to look at the data, the trends, the numbers. It's less easy, it's less sexy, it takes time, but it's more instructive. And on this point, you've argued that the situation, is probably not as bad as some people fear overall.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that there was, maybe especially in 2016 and 17, a language of crisis and catastrophe that seemed to be very, very pervasive in public discourse. And it was entirely untethered to what was actually happening on the ground in the United States. It was driven overwhelmingly not by student attitudes so much as a small number of incidents, typically involving liberal or left-wing students blocking or interfering with the ability of speakers to come to campus and say whatever's in their mind. I'm sure you know the incidents as well as I do. Actors like Milo Yiannopoulos this, right-wing firebrand, Richard Spencer, this white supremacist. These people came to campus, they tried to speak, and all hell broke loose. In many cases, it was people who were speaking who were much less inflammatory. There are conservatives who I disagree with strongly, who nevertheless, there's this no possible justification for doing what happened. Like Ben Shapiro, for instance. I have a great deal of contempt for Ben Shapiro, but there's no reason to deplatform him the way that he consistently was deplatformed in 2016 and 2017. These incidents, they were few in number. I think there was a grand total of something like 48 attempted deplatformings, not just successful, but attempted deplatformings in the entire United States, according to FIRE in 2017, which is the height of these incidents. So you figure there's, about 21 million undergraduates and graduate students. There are about 4,700 institutions of higher learning. We're talking about 48 incidents. It just beggars belief to think that those 48 incidents merited the panicked response that they received. So in that sense, I will maintain that the language of crisis was entirely unnecessary and arguably helped to open up the door to these new kinds of attempted censoring or these new attempted attacks on higher ed from the right.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of my long-winded spiel there about this.
It's quite all right. I just wanted to maybe some people would retort that, okay, you have indeed millions of students and you have hundreds of campuses, but if you focus on the elite campuses, if you focus on some disciplines, then that's where you have pretty much all the problems, and now the proportion doesn't look that tiny.
You mean if we just look at, like, for instance, the Ivy League universities or the top universities?
For instance, and then, you might want to focus on students who are enrolled in programs, specific, majors typically.
Well, as far as I know, there's no research that breaks things down by major or by field of study to see, where these students are coming. If I understand your implication, it's the idea that students in typically, quote unquote, like left wing branches of the university are more likely to do this. That is entirely possible. Just like I said earlier, if you are in social sciences, you are disproportionately likely to be politically active. Okay. And if you understand these kinds of deplatforming attempts as political activism, which I think we should, then it's entirely plausible that you would see it coming from a certain cluster. It's also the case that many of these incidents happened during the run-up to and immediately after the 2016 campaign of Clinton and Trump. And that certainly triggered this wave of left-wing agitation and activism. And it wouldn't surprise me again if you saw that clustering in the areas of the university where liberals tend to dominate, which is in the non-STEM fields, the fields of humanities and social sciences. So I think that's I think a totally reasonable inference to make. I don't know whether or not elite universities are probably the most likely or disproportionately likely to be the site of these kinds of incidents. At the same time, we don't really know what's going on there. Take Harvard. Harvard has had something like, I think, 5 or 6 deplatforming attempts in the last 8 years. I'm not positive about those numbers, but it's something like that. You figure Harvard must invite more speakers and more high-profile speakers than virtually any other private university in America. They're ridiculously wealthy. It is a real privilege, many people would say, to be invited to speak there. If Harvard invites a former presidential candidate or a high-profile politician, they're very likely to come in a way that they are not likely to come to a non-elite university. So, again, I think we need to ask ourselves what's going on there. Is this a case of elite universities being disproportionately likely to deplatform, or is it that they have more opportunities to deplatform? You see the distinction I'm trying to make?
Surely, that's a good point. I mean, yeah.
But I do want to emphasize. I mean, I'm imagining like a member of your audience who's rolling their eyes right now because they think that I'm making an excuse. I'm not. I honestly, I don't really have any tolerance for these kinds of deplatforming incidents, and I also think that it's entirely plausible that the students who are going to Harvard and going to Yale or Princeton feel like they have a special responsibility to deplatform in a way that other students who are balancing childcare duties and working part-time or even full-time and are just trying to keep their, students who might not be going to elite institutions. I think it's entirely plausible that we see greater disruptive activism in elite institutions than we do elsewhere. I just think that the disproportion is probably not quite as bad as we think, and a lot of question marks that we don't really have answers to yet.
Okay, fair enough. I realized actually something that I hadn't even thought of asking you, and something that's rarely discussed because, it's fairly rare, but maybe you have instances in mind. So we started with this paradigm that, left-wing threats to free speech on campus come from within academia, the right-wing threats come from without academia. Do you have in mind an instance of a right-wing threat to campus free speech coming from within academia?
All the time. When we say that 10 incidents on campus tend to be generated from the political left, I mean that's a tendency that they make a majority. But if someone were to go right now to the Foundation for Individual Rights Education's website, they have this thing called the Disinvitation Database, and people should just Google it and they'll find it. You can look at how many incidents come from the right versus how many come from the left, and then you can kind of figure out which ones are on campus versus off campus. So, the cliche we said earlier is totally true. However, roughly a third of all the on-campus attempts are from the political right. So that's one out of every three. That's significant.
It's pretty high. Yeah.
It's very high. So what can we say about these incidents? Well, they very often involve Israel and Palestine. So earlier, I mentioned an incident where the Massachusetts Republican Party filed a lawsuit to block a conference. What I didn't mention at that point is that the lawsuit was initiated by students. It was initiated by conservative or pro-Israel students on campus who objected to the university hosting this event. So that was a student-driven lawsuit that the Massachusetts GOP just supported and helped to direct. Many other incidents of faculty who have said a controversial statement, who have said something that's deemed unpatriotic, have found themselves targeted by students. In fact, very often, a group like Campus Reform relies on these students for video and audio or information about these speeches. So Campus Reform is a very small core of professional employees. It's overwhelmingly student journalists who are on the right, who record their professor saying something terrible, and then they raise a fuss and they submit it to Campus Reform for amplification. So Campus Reform is a great example. Turning Points USA, that's another example of a student-driven institution where right-wing activists in the student body kind of raise a fuss and try to get these people punished. And there are many incidents just like this. Let's see. I mean, Xavier Becerra. Xavier Becerra was the California Attorney General, a Democrat, a rising star in the state party and the National Party. He was deplatformed from a California university. I'm blanking on which one. He was deplatformed by activists on the political right. This just happened, I think, 2 years ago or so. So, I mean, there are many examples of attempted and successful deplatformings or faculty terminations because of activism from students on the right.
Okay, yeah. I have reached, I think, the end of my questions. Do you think I failed to ask you about something important?
The only thing I think that we didn't talk about is this very broad question of whether or not students are self-censoring on campus. Mm-hmm. Whether or not, you and I have been talking, I think, quite rightly about the issue of formal attacks on free speech. Somebody who is silenced by an administrator or a politician or whatever. There's this other question about whether or not students are self-censoring because they want to fit in, because they don't want to attract the anger of their classmates or their professors. Mm-hmm. And that's a big question that maybe we can't really deal with today. But if there is a problem with free speech on campus, I think this is where you're most likely to find it, with students declining to speak for reasons of informal social sanction, and not because they're being deplatformed or punished. And that's where I think we need to spend more of our attention.
Mm-hmm. And what about academics? Do you think there is a similar dynamics for them, a fear of their colleagues, their students?
I mean, possibly. When you look at some of the very scant survey data we have, we do see some faculty who are hesitant to discuss certain things. And I think it's quite likely that as universities transition to increasing reliance on contingent temporary labor, people who don't have the protections of tenure or are not unionized, we are likely to see greater self-censorship, which is why I think one of the best possible plausible solutions to this problem of faculty free speech and preserving it is increased unionization in institutions. I think in France and as well as in Canada, we have an admirably strong public sector protected by labor law and unionization that helps to strengthen academic freedom. In the United States, it's a mess. In the United States, only about 20% of faculty are unionized, which is a scandal, and it leaves many faculty exposed. And I think if there is a route to changing certain worrying dynamics, that's the best one, is to increase the strength of unions.
Fair enough. So I suppose we can conclude. I guess we could say, I don't know, I think you will probably agree with me, but we've spent most of the interview trying to distinguish to some extent between threats to campus free speech coming from the left, from the right. One can try to quantify it to see which side is the worst offender. It might, depend where and when you're looking, I suppose. But, at least my closing remarks would be that wherever they come from, what's important is not really to focus on that. It's more to defend the speech of whichever person is being targeted.
I mean that's. I wish I could even just give you that. I think that's complicated because maybe there are certain kinds of exceptions or limits that we should be thinking about when it comes to what is protected by academic freedom and what isn't. But I can certainly agree with you that it's impossible to quantify which side is worse. I'm very, very bored by the conversation of the right is worse than the left, or the left is worse than the right. I just don't. There's no way to resolve it, and I think there are more important issues at stake.
Okay. Would you like to add anything else?
No, just that I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope you and your listeners did as well.
Well, I certainly did. I was happy to finally have you on. And
yeah, we were playing phone tag for a little while, but I'm glad that it worked because it was a great conversation.
So thank you very much for coming.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much, Vincent. That was a good conversation.
Yeah, thanks again. So have a nice day, and we will let you know when it's out. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Thank you for listening to Liberté Académique. We are a science, critical thinking, and freedom podcast. We interview researchers, teachers, and authors who have interesting ideas and who defend free, rational, evidence-based thought. We oppose as best we can a sort of anti-intellectualism coming from a section of the intellectual class. We carry out interviews in English and in French. You can find all our episodes on YouTube and on SoundCloud, as well as on the main podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, and several others. We are also present on Twitter at @acadfreedom and also on Facebook.